we want to look at our vision. And the Gear Up vision is that every student prepared for college success. Not just that every student has the opportunity to go to college, but every student is prepared to be successful when they do choose to go to college. And that's a really important guiding factor that we use in anything that we do with the project. So what's our purpose for being here today? Well, we're going to look at the report that you just received, and it's a big report. There's a lot of information in it. And we want to think about the characteristics of the report as well as the information that's in the report and how we use that information to kind of help guide our next steps. Begin thinking about how all of the information that we do have and that we've gathered all year long, how we kind of put all that together and use that as a framework for making our next steps for the future. So we'll look at two aspects of the report. We'll look at the components of the report, and then we'll look at the information in the report. So we'll talk about the features as well as the content. And the features are pretty extensive. You'll notice one of the first things you'll see in the report is the ACT College Readiness Standards charts. These charts that are in the main body of the report are not the extensive charts. Those are in the appendix, but they are some of the highlighted and key indicators. They show a mix of high-level and lower-level skills. You'll see the count, and that is the number of observations that indicator was observed in the walkthroughs in your building. So, for instance, on this chart, the first estimation standard was not observed, but the next two standards were observed 5 times each out of a total of 5 teacher observations in that school. You'll get the percentage of that breaks down to it for your school as well as the project.
And remember, in the state of Kentucky, college readiness is defined as students meeting benchmark on ACT. So while this is probably not new to most of you, we went back to those ACT college readiness standards and to the tests themselves and looked at what is being assessed, and then are we observing those on a snapshot day. I want to say that right at the beginning. This is a snapshot of your school. We were there for one day with the team, but what we assume that we'll find will be patterns of instruction, patterns of the standards being present or not being present, and then we check those with other indicators. As Roland explains what's in the report, you'll see we triangulate those with state assessment scores, K-Prep, and with EPAS, the Explore test, to get a bigger picture of what's going on instructionally at your school.
Thanks, Victoria. I want to say thank you for the message. We'll try to make sure that we're keeping our volume up. A little bit of that may be the internet traffic, but we'll keep working on that as we go forward. Another characteristic of the report is underneath the standards, you'll notice there are some analysis statements for each content area, and those analysis statements were triggered by the presence or lack of presence of certain key indicators, and they talk about that. So, for instance, in science, you may have standards 1.1 and 1.2, which are the kind of understanding information and reading for information, and so whether or not those standards were observed or not will trigger a different if-then statement for you. So look at those statements because they are specialized for your data. The next piece that we want to look at is in the bottom right-hand corner of the pages. You'll see a how to use this component of the information. So it's how to use it with teachers. It's how to use it with PLC structures. It's a variety of different ways of thinking about how do I use this information to really have an impact on instruction in my classroom, in my school. The next piece you'll see is some extra charts on it that accompany the standards. For instance, with math, you see this one that talks about the math tools of presence and whether or not they were being used. You'll also see with science a comparison of the EPAS and K-Prep standards, and we'll talk about those more as we go along as well. And then the next piece we look at are the instructional shifts that accompany the Common Core anchor standards and literacy anchor standards. And there are 3 components to that. We looked at the reading and close reading standards. We looked at the reading, writing, speaking, and listening anchor standards. And then we also looked at the mathematical practice standards in math and the shifts that accompany the new standards. So this section is more about processes that were used in the classroom than they were about what standards were being addressed and taught.
And these are new to this report. We didn't look at these last time because the standards had just been adopted statewide, but I just want to ask you to recall that not only are these standards part of SB1, but they also align with the priorities of Gear Up Kentucky. And so it's a priority of this project that these standards be addressed as an effort to have kids college ready. And again, we didn't pick out all of the standards. We just picked out some critical ones that we would expect to see as the standards are being implemented.
You'll also see an EPAS item analysis with a brief description of what the content of the question was. We can't release those items because that's not okay with ACT, but what we did do is describe what was going on, what the process was for that question, and then identified what standards were being addressed. Along with that, you'll notice as you read across item 3, passage 1, for instance, you'll see the percent for your school correct and the percent for the project correct. And then underneath that, you'll see for the standard that that item was addressing, you'll see the observation percentage for your school to go along with that. So that kind of helps you corroborate was on this day that we were in the building. Again, a one-day snapshot, so you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a one-to-one correlation. But were those standards being addressed to help support that item? And so when you begin looking at some of the higher level items and some of the lower level items, I can kind of tell you, is it matching up with our expectations? If our percentages of that kind of instruction are low in the building and our success on those kinds of items are low, there's probably a correlation there, and we can look at that. Additionally, we look at the school performance guide. The school performance guide really is, again, that college-going rubric that we look at systematically. How are we going about addressing college readiness for our students? And this is a really important document for us because it guides all of the work that we do. And this gives us kind of a measure of, well, where were we 3 years ago? Where are we now? And what do we need to continue to do to be at that achieving a college-going culture in our schools in 3 more years? And so this document really becomes the basis of a lot of what we do going forward as well. And so it's this document, when we get to that point in the section in the report, that we'll talk about some follow-up conversations that we would like to have. And last but certainly not least, and this is an area, a place a lot of leaders and administrators start by looking at, and this is the summary of instructional patterns from the observations. So this is that qualitative piece. What did the observers see when they were in your buildings? What are some of the highlights? What are some of the areas of concern? What are some of the areas for opportunity for growth? And so that is in the last section of the report. And then last but certainly not least, there's the appendix. And again, the appendix carry all the full charts that we didn't put in the report itself. So they'll have all the full charts for math standards, all the full charts for ELA writing and reading as well. So let's get started. Let's talk about the ACT College Readiness Standards in that section. Again, we've already kind of identified what the layout of the charts is, but I'll go through that again real quickly. Here you have the count, the number of observations in which that standard was identified in your building. Again, out of this case, there were 14 observations, and then that gives you the percentage compared to the project percentage. I want to draw your attention to a couple of different standards. Notice on supporting details, locating basic facts, and scanning a text to locate details. These standards tend to be highly observed because there's some lower level standards. Can the students look at the text and identify some details from that text? It doesn't mean that they're doing a whole lot with it. So we want to see that, but we also want to look for presence of these higher level standards. Can they do the things like the sequencing, the comparing, the cause and effect relationship identifying? And this is a really kind of good check for you to do in your building as well. Is there a predominance of lower level standards, or is there also those higher level inferencing standards? And this is important because if you look at this is combined reading data. So this is from the data from both the social studies and the ELA classrooms in that building. And this kind of gives you an overall picture about what reading might look like in those two content areas.
I also want to say something briefly about using prediction when reading a literary text. The idea of being an active reader, and one of the things that the research points to is that readers who ask themselves elaborating questions and who make predictions when they read, in fact, create more meaning out of what they read, retain more, and can apply more. So these standards like inferencing and making predictions are really important. If you're a school leader, you're observing classes, you're attending PLCs with teachers who teach reading, or who apply reading skills in their classes. These are things you want to point out to them and ask them to be mindful of.
So in this school, overall, we see a pretty high level of the higher level expectations, a pretty high rate of that, 7, 11. Now, again, the prediction is lower one there, but at least somewhere in that category we're seeing some of those standards. And that's something to keep track of. So as you begin looking at the other reading standards, you also get a breakdown for social studies, and you'll get a breakdown for ELA. So again, you can kind of make that same comparison. And as we're looking at a lot of informational reading, moving into the social studies and science departments, it's important that we think about how we support those teachers in being able to achieve those higher level standards. If the ELA department is the one carrying most of the weight, then it's important that we think about how we scaffold in those other areas, content areas, those teachers to be able to do that. Again, remember, they were not trained as reading teachers, but they are teachers of reading because their students need that skill in order to learn their content. So as we look at writing, for the second time that we've done the process, writing standards were lower than the other standards. This is a concern for the project overall, and it is an area that Kentucky has been a leader for the last 20 years because of the writing portfolio, and the issue being we're not seeing a lot of the revising process. There was active trying to locate some of that data by looking at if writing was present in the observation. Observers went and looked for evidence either with a writing portfolio, a working portfolio, or the student's writing notebook, that they were doing the kind of revision that is necessary to be successful in the ACT kinds of writing.
And if I can just put my former English teacher's hat on for a moment, one of the things that's so important about this is that students use writing as a way of clarifying their understanding of content. And they also use writing, when it's taught well, to correct grammatical and meaning errors. And all of us, I think, probably have been in school at times where we were taught grammar and punctuation context-free, not within the context of our writing. It doesn't have a lot of meaning that way. But what we should be seeing in ELA classrooms in particular, but in other classrooms that use writing, is students revising their writing not only for meaning, not only for clarity of understanding, but also to make sure that they don't have grammatical and technical errors in their writing.
So I do want to draw your attention again
there
to
it is, right.
that bottom right-hand corner. What are some of those skills? And Deborah just mentioned some of that. But the issue is one of the things that we encourage you to do is not just talk to the teachers, but talk to the students about that revision process. And again, this is something she just mentioned. And again, more of these ideas are with each set of standards in the report. So we want to encourage you to use that section. There was a question about where do these numbers come from. They are very intentionally chosen from a variety of schools. In fact, what I tried to do is choose a different school for each data. So there won't be any school that's overrepresented here. If anybody, we didn't want anybody to feel like we were picking on them or using them as an example. So it's a variety of different schools that we use for the slide for the presentation today.
Remember, we collected data in, was it 29 schools, 30 schools? All right, so there'll be a chart from math from one school and from English from another school, for example.
As we look at the math standards are a little bit different than the reading, writing, and science standards in that they are more content standards and less about process. So you look at these standards slightly differently than you do the other standards, but there are still some things that we want to draw our attention to. It may just be that the teacher was teaching geometry on that day, so you're not going to see algebra or number on that in your observations, and that's okay. But there are still some lower level skills, some process skills in some ways, because if you look at these two standards right here under basic operations and applications, these are the computation or the arithmetic standards that you would expect to see when students are problem solving. It's not that these two standards are generally explicitly taught, but that they are accessed as students are working through other problems. So in that case, this first section really is a kind of a process standard. That's why the estimation standard is a standard that we look at very carefully. We know that number sense and number development and sense making at the middle schools are a really critical aspect of mathematics instruction. And so we're always looking for, are there ways that teachers are supporting students in developing their number sense? And the estimation standard is one that we use as that measure. And it's an area that the project as a whole has been a little bit lacking in. It's one that we always want to encourage you and your teachers to continue to work with them, their students, to estimate as they're working through problems. Can they make sense of the numbers that are involved in the process? Can they get an idea of where they're going and work through that? And not that they have to be within a certain rounding range, but they can make sense of, is the answer too big? Is the answer too small? Is the answer about right? So that's one of those areas. Another area that we want to look at when we look at mathematics is probability, statistics, and data analysis. The reason this section is a section that we want to see if it's being focused on is that it's an area that supports very directly science instruction and science analysis of data. And we know at the ACT level, one of the greatest predictors of success in the ACT science is success in Algebra 2. Again, because it's that data analysis skills that come out of math to support the science skills. So this is an area, even at the middle school, that teachers can use this area to support science instruction. So this is a great area for interdisciplinary support of each other.
Okay, we see the note on volume, and we actually have a little volume thing there that we need to pay attention to.
We'll continue to work on that. I think part of that is we need to slow down. Whenever I start talking too fast, that's what happens. The science standards are process standards. And as we look at the science standards, this one is, you'll notice a chart that we actually put the entire chart in the main body of the report because the entire process is really critical to science success. One of the things that we observed were a lot of opportunities for students to be actively engaged in some science activity. What we did not observe as much, again, for the second cycle, as much of the prediction and hypothesis making or the conclusion, synthesis, analysis kind of important work. And so it's really critical that as we look at the entire process, we have students working all the way through, from the very beginning all the way through the end as we think about that. It's critical if you look at the science standards that we have two different sets of standards in science class, and what you can see here is that we have a lot more success at the K-Prep content area standards than we're having at the Explore process standards around the experimental method and scientific design. Scientific method and experimental design, I'm sorry. And so this is something that as we begin working with the content, providing students opportunity to do some data collection and analysis around that, as well as prediction making, is a critical piece. I'm going to do all that now. I'm catching up, sorry. So let's make our jump now from the ACT College Readiness Standards now to the Common Core Instructional Shifts.
Before we do that, are there any questions on the ACT College Readiness Standards? You have 2 years of data on those from 2012 and currently. Any questions? Okay, so we're going to go on now to data that we did not collect the first time, so this is just single year, and it's using a different scale, is that right?
Yeah. So, well, this is not. This is just using was it present or not. Again, just like the standards and the indicators. And in this chart, you'll notice that there is a comparison of ELA, social studies, and science. In the anchor standards, Common Core anchor standards, these literacy anchor standards are in all content areas with the exception of the technical areas, and that includes math. So what kind of reading and close reading of text are students expected to be able to do in ELA, social studies, and science? And again, this is not necessarily literary reading. It's the kind of reading they would do in support of that discipline. So in science, they're doing things like reading charts, reading tables, the same kind of analysis that the ACT College Readiness Standards have them doing as well. You can note here kind of a discrepancy in some of the approaches for science in this school. This is a small set of observations, so you have 9 ELA observations, 5 science, and 5 social studies observations. And you'll notice some engagement with the informational reading across all 3 content areas, but only literary reading in the ELA classroom. And that's to be expected. It's not that you'll see literary reading in all 3 disciplines. One of the recommendations for Common Core is that we're looking at approximately a 60-40 split between informational and literary reading. In this case, on that particular day, there was 80% informational and 20% literary. So that's not a bad split. Again, that's just where they were on that one day. It's again, this kind of corroborates the reading standards that we looked at earlier when we looked at that combined reading. And again, it's important to understand how we support social studies and science teachers in being able to teach students how to read at higher levels. Are they having students make inferences? Are they having students cite evidence from the text when they're having their discussion or when they're making their argument? Those kinds of skills are skills that need to be developed among the teachers as well as among the students. And continued practice and generalization will help there. As we look at the reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills, the intentionality of these indicators is really the piece that we noticed was lacking in schools right now. We think that there seems to be quite a bit of conversation going on, a move towards more student-centered discourse in classrooms, but what we're not seeing is the organization of these expectations that encourage students to be doing things like citing evidence from text as they're engaged in conversations, as they're critiquing the thinking of others, and citing evidence from the student's conversation as well as from the text they were reading for those critiques. And those higher level skills are critical. And again, I think it's an intentionality issue and a support for teachers to understand how they have students do things like present ideas from reading in diverse media. So how do they have them cite that information in their conversations? Anything you want to add here? No? Okay. Again, you can look across and see, is it present in all three content areas? So you'll notice here the student prepared for academic dialogue by studying and citing evidence. It was in evidence in all three content areas, less so in the science. Students pose and answer questions about text and its meaning, so they're asking questions about the text they're reading, but they're not necessarily using it in their dialogue with each other. So that's something we can begin to push on, so you can begin to do some analysis here. It doesn't surprise me that in this case the students present ideas from reading in diverse media was higher in science because they may have been doing some table analysis or data analysis, which would bring that into play as diverse media, not just a specific paragraph of reading text. There is one note of change on the first set of reports that you were sent, and that is that this data average for the overall means needs to go up one and these two drop down. You'll be sent the revised report this week, so that information will be corrected there. Last but certainly not least in the Common Core, we want to look at the standard mathematical practice standards, and these are the instructional shifts that accompany the new content standards. Now, with this data, there was a slight change in how we were looking at it because we were testing out whether or not we could use a 3-point scale, 0 being not observed, 1 being observed, 2 being exemplary or strong use. And that rating, we have some mixed feelings about that rating, so we'll look at how we report that next time. But what we did here, you can't necessarily, a 0.8 doesn't necessarily mean that it was observed with strong fidelity. It could be there was a few exemplary uses and then not present in the other ones, which is causing some problems in our analysis, but that is there. These are the standard. These are the practices that that kind of help correlate to the reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and the reading and close reading standards. Problem solving, where students are going to be reading and rereading problems and close reading of problems and the diagrams that accompany that, and the constructing viable arguments and critiquing the thinking of others very much directly correlates to the same kinds of practices that we have in the reading, writing, speaking, and listening standards. So it's not that in math they're not reading and not having discourse, it's just under a different name as they look at that.
So subtly or not so subtly, there's a move in the Common Core standards to have students more engaged and involved and thinking for themselves as opposed to the teachers thinking for them. So what this would suggest is less lecturing, less notes and worksheets, but more opportunities for students to make sense of what they're learning, to advance ideas and theories, to have those challenged by their peers. It's a very different way of teaching, and we understand that it takes some time to achieve that. And so we're looking for, at this point, really initial implementation. I mean, when we saw exemplary use, we were thrilled and noted that, but basically what we're trying to find out is 3 years into this project and into the adoption of the standards, are teachers making those shifts, and therefore are they better preparing students for college and career?
As we look at the analysis of this, what we're seeing is approximately 4.5%, or about just under 5% of these kinds of practices were rated at the exemplary level. So we know that there is some of that going on. It's also very important to recognize at year 3 of implementation of the Common Core, there may be some implementation dip. And that's one of the things as we're looking at it, as these student-centered approaches begin to take a stronger foothold in classrooms, is there the potential for a little bit of slide back on some of the ACT assessments because of that process as teachers learn that process as well as students learn those processes. So it's something we're keeping our eye on. The rigor, relevance, and differentiation framework is not a new framework for Kentucky. This is data that we collected in 2012. It's also data that we collected this year. And this kind of gives you an idea of where instruction is centered in the classroom. The rigor relevance section starts with application, so we're not even looking at recall level of instruction right now. we're looking at the kind of instruction that has students applying the concepts and skills, assimilating the concepts and skills, or even at highest level, adapting the concepts and skills. And again, this is on a 4-point scale, 0 being not present, 1 being minimal, 2 being moderate, and 3 being strong. So I'm going to walk you through real quickly what that might look like in a math classroom. So in a mathematics classroom, if the students are working on a routine problem set worksheet where it's 10 problems, all of the same concept and skill, and they're really basically applying the exact same process, that's going to be 0. That is not an application of the concept. It's a very plain, even if it is a word problem, but all the word problems have the same setup. That would not get us even to a scale of 1. But if students were working on a small set of problems that had some different approaches to that kind of application of a concept, for instance, if students were working on some Pythagorean theorem problems that had them identifying the right triangle applications in some word problems, but it wasn't necessarily the exact same application in each set, that might get you to a 1. So there would be a little bit more discourse, students working together on that. That would get them to a minimal standard of application. Where you might see it jump into a moderate range could be a whole group setting even, where the teacher was working with students to work through a problem. So it would be absolutely a non-routine problem where they're kind of constructing this idea and applying this concept to a real-world situation. But there's a threshold here. To be able to kind of get to that moderate range, it's a threshold of at least 50% of the students participating in the conversation, not just listening, but actively engaged in the conversation where they're adding something. And using some simple discourse strategies like a think, pair, share, or some intentional grouping would allow teachers to move from that minimal to that moderate range, even with a whole group setting, if they engage students in thinking about the process, have them predicting what they think should happen next, how they might do this process differently, having them really think about and adding their own thinking to the conversation. And then to get to that 3, or that really strong application, it would really be, for instance, the students going outside and measuring the height of the school building or measuring the height of the flagpole using a clinometer, and they are all working together to figure out their distance. They're measuring the distance from the flagpole to where they are. They're measuring the angle of refraction with the clinometer. They're having to calculate the height of that flagpole and take into account how high they are, their angle was off the ground when they made that measurement, and add that measurement in there. So all the things that go into a real-life application of that content, that would be the kind of thing you might see to get to a 3, that strong application.
Right, and so adaptation suggests that the students are doing something different with the knowledge than they've ever done before. They're applying it to an unpredictable situation. They're filling in with a strategy maybe they haven't learned. So they're asked to do something where they don't have all the procedures and the strategies at hand, and they have to create something, which is much different than just feeding it back to the teacher. And even at assimilation, students would be asked to make reference to something they've learned before, see if they can kind of sort through the strategies they know and pull ones out that might help them solve something that they're not used to solving. So what we're saying is we did not see a lot of work in math or in science or even in ELA where students were bringing some inventiveness and some strategy to the work that they were doing. It was much more repeating things they'd learned before, maybe making some connections to real world, but certainly not at a level that's going to get them ready for college.
And as we begin to move into this next session, we begin looking at the EPAS item analysis, and we begin thinking about the higher level questions. If instruction never gets at assimilation on a very minor scale and not very routinely, students are going to struggle to be able to handle those kinds of questions. So there's a direct correlation between the level of instruction we see in a daily in a classroom and how students do on these EPAS assessments or these higher level questionings. And so that's something to keep in mind as you begin looking, especially at this assimilation and adaptation levels. If you don't have that kind of instruction occurring in the classroom, students are really, really going to struggle on those kinds of assessments. Another area, a couple of areas that we want to draw your attention to is the assessment that moves beyond recall to demonstration of learning, and the one here that has students different ways students have the ability to demonstrate learning. These are 2 key areas that we look at when we're looking at classroom instruction. Is is instruction geared totally towards the test or an assessment? So the ultimate icon that's coming out, or the ultimate outcome that's coming out is, oh, how are they doing on this paper and pencil test? If that's where you're gearing all of your instruction, you're really not giving students that rich, full area, that rich, full opportunity to engage with the content. So we look at these two areas: assessment that moves beyond recall to demonstration, and different ways for students to be able to demonstrate their learning as kinds of ways to really see how schools are doing when they begin to assess what students are doing.
And this whole section is important, first of all, because it reflects the KDE's emphasis on rigor relevance framework that comes out of the work of Bill Daggett. But secondly, I want to take kind of a larger view of this. So as a state and as a nation, but particularly as a state, we've been in the process of raising standards for students, making sure that all kids have an option to go to college. And so in doing that, they need rigorous instruction. They need to not be spoon-fed the answers, but to have a chance to really kind of create and invent answers for themselves within the context of what they're learning. The work needs to be relevant, to kind of pull on things that are of interest or within their own experience that they can relate to. And then this whole section on differentiation is important because if we want all students to have really rigorous, rich, challenging work, they're not all going to get there at the same time or in the same way. And so what we're looking at is, do teachers differentiate? If Roland, for example, kind of a real-world example, is slower than I am in his learning, does Roland get more time? Or does Roland get materials at a different reading level? Perhaps I'm a more proficient reader, again, drawing from real life, just kidding. But say that I'm a more proficient reader and can read higher level work, Roland can deal with those ideas. He just may need the material at a slightly lower level. In terms of scaffolding, do teachers look at how their kids are interacting with the content and give more support to students who need it, teach it a different way, not just louder, but using a different strategy? And again, are there different ways for students to demonstrate learning? So we see this whole set of data as being really critical to our kids ready for college, not only in terms of how they function on tests, but do they have the wherewithal so that when they get to college, they're going to be independent, self-sufficient learners? That's really what we're looking at. Sorry, Roland, I didn't insult your intelligence there.
Okay. The truth hurts sometimes, but I'm okay with that. So yeah, and that's a great explanation. I know that relevance, when we begin looking at rigor, one of the first proxies we can look at as teachers begin to change instruction and increase it is engagement. And if it's not highly relevant to students, they won't be engaged. And if they're not engaged, you can't get to that kind of rigor that we're talking about. That's an important point to note. As we begin to look at the explore item analysis, you'll notice in the charts, you'll see the item and a brief description of what that item was about, the percent that your school did correct compared to the project, and then the standards that were being addressed, how they were observed that day. In this case, it may look like there's a solid correlation between a little bit stronger performance and that standard being addressed more specifically. So that really is that determining the details in a text essential for understanding of an author's intent, and how you look at the details to really help understand the purpose and the tone of an article, even if it's an informational article. And in this case, we can look here at item 30, again, about the same as a project, but you'll notice a higher level of implementation of that standard, drawing conclusions. So one of the things we look at is the percent of standards that are observed on a daily basis. So we know we were only in your building one day, but as you're doing your own walkthroughs, do some of these kinds of tallies and say, well, when I was in there, what standards did I see in observance? And that really kind of does train us to think about what is the goal of what's the outcome goal, not necessarily what's in the lesson plans or what the stated teacher idea is, but what's happening from the student's perspective, from what you're seeing. In science, again, we look at the issue of there's a couple of different types of questions, and we want to draw your attention to the standards that are being addressed in this item. It's very important that we note that in a science assessment, one of the two standards being addressed was reading tables and graphs, which is a math standard. And again, that direct correlation between the math standards, especially those probability data analysis standards, and success for science students. So this is a great way, again, we mentioned earlier about that interdisciplinary work. If science teachers are struggling on the data analysis and the conclusion side, maybe they can work with the math teacher to bring some of that into the math class, and again, kind of create that idea of the interdisciplinary unit or approach. Now let's look at the school performance guide. And one of the first things I want to say here is this is just really for your school. This is not an issue of, oh, we're all trying to get over to column 3 because that's where the project wants us, and this is we want to show that we're a college going to school. That's not the goal of this is self-analysis. The goal of this self-analysis is to really understand where our school is as a whole, kind of a holistic approach, and understand where are our focus areas and how are we doing, and is there evidence to support us being in that square one stage, the developing stage, or the achieving stage. And if we're not in that achieving stage at this point in time, that's okay. It's not doing anybody any favors if we have a whole bunch of ratings at the achieving, but we're not there yet. I think this school is looking at it and saying, hey, we're getting some developing practices, but we're not all the way there yet. I think that's looks like a very solid self-analysis of where they are. And again, things to look for. When you look at this indicator under rigor, ACT college readiness standards addressed, look back at your charts. Were those was there evidence of those standards being addressed during the walkthroughs? And again, we understand it's one-day snapshot, but overall, if they're not there, then we shouldn't really be putting ourselves in this last category.
I'd like to say 2 things about the performance guide. The first one is that this guide and these standards are really at the core of the walkthroughs. The goal of Gear Up to create and sustain a college-going culture beyond the life of the grant, and also, of course, tied to the sustainability plans. So in past walkthroughs, we've tried to carve out some time to meet with the principal and the leadership team, ideally, to talk about the self-assessment. Is it moving? What's evidence? And one of the things that we found is that those meetings were rushed, and oftentimes we had not completed our visits, and so we really couldn't say what we were seeing in classes. And so instead of doing that meeting during the walkthrough, we're going to schedule those via phone call over the next few weeks. And the purpose of that is to look at this self-assessment, to pull evidence from the larger report, and then to kind of come up with some next steps. So if we're not all in the 3rd column, we're not at a place where we have a college-going culture for all students, what do we need to do to get there based on the evidence of the report?
Right. And again, we want to look at the kind of evidence. So student work reflects standards and best effort. If you're giving yourself that rating, one of the things to look for is what kind of evidence do you see on bulletin boards of student work that's being posted? What kind of evidence for rubrics that students can assess their own quality of what they're doing, and how students are helped and supported in achieving that highest level of that rubric. And if those rubrics aren't in place for presentations or PowerPoint presentations or research reports, then think about how are teachers scaffolding in support for students to be successful in those kinds of presentations and those kinds of outcomes. So that's an important piece that we're drawing attention to. Again, as Deborah mentioned, sustainability is that sustainability plan piece, and we begin looking at growth areas and areas where we are making stronger gains. So all of these areas, again, are a key center to what we're doing with the project.
Can you pull down the screen again?
Sorry.
See if we have any questions.
So do we have any questions so far? It sounds like we're being a little more consistent with our volume.
Yes.
Okay. The last section of the report is the qualitative description of patterns that were observed in the building. You'll see an overall pattern. We try to use some pictures from your building for everybody's report, and then you have some specific content area comments that kind of help support different patterns that were observed, correlations back to the rigor, relevance, differentiation framework, and the ACT college readiness standards. So a little bit of that triangulation of data. And again, one of the pieces of a walkthrough report like this is not that this is the end-all be-all report. There's a lot of information in here, don't get me wrong, but what we want you to do is use this to corroborate what you already know from your own walkthroughs, what you already know from your ePass and MAP data and your ThinkLink data, and where you think might be a good leverage points with some of your faculty and how you can help them progress. And again, I want to draw your attention back to the how to use this report on the side of each one of the ACT college readiness pages. I think they give you some really nice suggestions for how to use this with PLCs, how to use this whole faculty as well.
This also, this section in particular goes back to the idea of the value of having another set of eyes in your building, and I'm talking now to those of you who are school leaders. So you do walkthroughs and formal visits, you meet with teachers during faculty meetings, during PLCs, department meetings, and you're always gathering data about what you see, just like teachers do in the classroom. But what we're trying to provide here is another set of eyes with another perspective on what we see in your school. It doesn't mean that it's any more right than what you see. It's just a different perspective. And so when you read those comments, this is our little disclaimer here. We're pretty direct. If we see things that we think you can leverage that are good practice, we give you credit for those and we congratulate you for those. If we see a lack of rigor, if we see a lack of student engagement, if we see the teachers doing all the work and the students not being challenged, we tell you that also, and it's not sugar-coated. So the disclaimer is please don't be offended. We could have written a lot of wraparound language and beat around the bush, but what we really wanted to say to you is here's some things you can build on, and here's some things you need to address from our perspective. Look at your other data and see if they ring true for you. But we did it in such a way as that we hope that it wouldn't raise questions, but give you something to go on.
And that's a great point. In the first report that we sent out, it was much more cursory. We didn't have a history with you all. We didn't have 3 years of being in your buildings or working with you all in sustainability summits and transition summits. Now that we've had that, we can offer a little bit more depth of analysis than we could initially. I think there are some great things to do with the reports. If you want to look at rigor in your building, and again, we're looking at those student outcomes and different ways of demonstrating learning, and different ways those are differentiated. A student work analysis protocol with your PLCs is a great next step to really say, well, you know what, if you all agree or disagree that these aren't as strong as we would like them to be, then how do we get there? Student work analysis protocol is one that we've used with a lot of success with teachers to think about. But these are your expectations. How are you communicating them? And are students really getting to those expectations? Another great practice is to have leaders do your own walkthroughs. Look for the student ACT college readiness indicators. Look for the rigor relevance differentiation framework. Have peers do walkthroughs of other classrooms as well. That whole idea of peer assessment at the student level translates just as nicely to the teacher level. And getting used to this idea of having people look at the evidence, not necessarily, this is not a judgment call, this is a very objective view of what we're seeing in classrooms. So those are just a few more ways of extending the use of the report with your faculty. We want to draw your attention quickly to the next steps. Well, today is the next step on that one. I should have taken it off Tuesday, May 20th. We'll redo this tomorrow at 3 o'clock Eastern as well, and we encourage, if you were able to make it today, great. Encourage somebody else on your faculty to try to make it. And again, the more people who can talk to that data and talk about that data, the better off we are. And we also want to set up the individual phone calls. So if you want to start that process with us, please feel free to give me a call. You can call me at 502-895-9500, extension 323, or you have my email. You can always email me, and we'll set that call up with you.
Any questions before we close? All right, using our teacher wait time, hearing no questions, we'll go ahead then and sign off. Thank you so much for participating.
Thanks, Victoria, for your comment.